And so now I'm thrilled to offer Andrew Lambert to speak. We had Andrew speak at our 2013 War of 1812 conference. He did a spectacular job there. And then his flight out on the following day, the Sunday, was much later. And so I had the honor of touring Andrew around the Niagara Peninsula and showing him a number of the War of 1812 sites. So accomplished historian. He has countless books out there, and he's going to use the material from one of his latest books as today's talk. So, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to introduce you to somebody who I think needs a little more introduction than he's had. Sir Julian Corbett, a great British strategic and historical writer of the early 20th century. And I'm going to hang this around the Quebec Tercentenary, which was an event staged in Canada with British participation to try and draw Canada into something that looks a little more like a country and try and break down some of those divisions between communities in Canada. The one thing I can say about the Tercentenary is it doesn't do those things you do today. It really doesn't recognize the native First Peoples' contribution. They're very much there as backdrop to an Anglo-French conversation, but things have moved on from that. So who was Sir Julian Corbett? Julian Corbett was born in 1854, the year the Crimean War began. He died in 1922, the year of the Washington Treaty. He grew up in an increasingly wealthy upper middle class background in southwest London. His father was a property developer and made a very large fortune. His family were liberals, which in the British sense means they're opposed to the conservatives. He's a progressive. He goes to a half-decent public school. He then goes to the top British university at Cambridge, where he gets a first-class law degree, and he practices as a courtroom attorney for some years. So he's clearly intellectually gifted. He has political convictions, and throughout his life, he has private means, which means he doesn't have to worry about whether he gets paid for his work. He can pick and choose his work by what he wants to do. And he was never, ever a pen for hire. He was never somebody who could be paid to write. He writes what he believes in. He's a conviction strategist and historian. And after his father's death, he retired from legal profession, but he remained a lawyer to the end of his days. And you can see that in the rather fanciful bookplate he created for himself. Ex Libris, Julian Stafford Corbett, Trinity College, Cambridge, and Middle Temple. He doesn't tell you that he's already a knight of the realm. That's obviously apparent from the drawing. He was also a trained artist. He drew this bookplate as well. He's having fun at the family crest, which is a crow. Whether he's entitled to use the family's arms is less clear. So he's a romantic medievalist. He does engage with romantic literature. In the 1880s, he was a very successful novelist. He wrote 4 outstanding novels, 3 of which are entirely based around the sea, and 1 around a mythical English colony in southern Morocco. They really do demonstrate his mastery of English prose. He traveled extensively. He was in Canada in the early 1880s as part of his North American tour. He'd been to India, he'd been through the Suez Canal, and he was often in Europe. This is a widely traveled, civilized, intellectually sophisticated man who has chosen to dedicate his life to the promotion of national strategic thinking. So he's not doing this as a job, he's doing this as a calling, a profession, which he does not get necessarily much pay for. Corbett recognized that strategy is a theoretical base, but ultimately it's a matter of national choice. There is no perfect strategy. There is only the best strategy for a particular country at a particular time. And the best guide to current thinking through experience, history, but using strategic theory and intelligence to inform those judgments. He knows that everybody develops strategic ideas which suit their own interests, and he tries to stand above that. He is a maritime strategist, he is pro-Navy, but he's thinking not about the interests of the Navy, but about the interests of Britain and the wider British Empire. This is the apogee of the British Empire, and he's thinking about an empire not in static terms. He's not a conservative, he's a liberal. He's thinking about how the empire will evolve. And by the time he comes to Quebec in 1908, it's already evolving quite rapidly. Canada is now a dominion. It is not ruled directly from London. It has its own institutions and is largely internally self-governing, as are Australia, New Zealand, and to a large extent South Africa. Corbett sees that in the future, the British Empire will not be an empire. It will be a commonwealth of nations which share common values and common interests, which will be predominantly about maintaining control of the sea and the economic benefits that flow from that. He sees the empire evolving into a living, breathing relationship in which the constituent parts are less and less dependent on London and have more and more influence on decisions taken in London on behalf of the empire. So Corbett calls this the Sea Commonwealth. The sea is going to be the unifying element, and he's working to make sure that Britain's sea control is able to protect this evolving process as the empire moves from one kind of structure to another. His cultural connections are enormously important. He is not a lawyer and a writer of history. He is also deeply involved in the worlds of literature, art, music. He knows everybody who matters in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. Here are a few of his friends. The somewhat grizzled, bearded fellow up on the left is Sir William Blake Richmond, perhaps the leading contemporary artist of the 1890s. He and Corbett had been friends for many years, probably dating back to Corbett's time as an art student. The other man on the top row is Thomas Edward Lawrence, also commonly known as Lawrence of Arabia. And these two men thought very much along the same lines about the nature of British strategy and warfare, that it was not a question of mass armies and engaging large German armies on the field of battle. And they discussed this over dinner in a famous entry in Corbett's diary, which I commend everybody to read. It is the opening passage of my book. The naval officer on the second row is Herbert Richmond, who is the son of Sir William Blake Richmond, and he was Corbett's most important intellectual peer, and also the man who carried on the Corbett message through to the end of the Second World War. And the fabulously mustachioed fellow at the end is Sir Edward Elgar, the leading British composer, perhaps of all time. And he too was a very close personal friend of Corbett. So we're dealing with somebody who's at the heart of national imperial culture, well-traveled. And when he thinks about the world, he does not think about it in narrow or pedestrian ways. In 1893, the Navy Records Society was founded in London by Professor Sir John Knox Laughton, whose name is on my chair, because I put it there to make it sound good, and Admiral Sir Cyprian Bridge, who was the Director of Naval Intelligence. It's a fusion of academic history and the intellectual needs of the Navy. It publishes original materials on the history of the Navy that help the contemporary Navy think about the future. Corbett was one of the first members, along with Alfred Thayer Mahan and the Russian naval attaché in London, Zinovy Petrovich Rojesvensky. You will probably have heard of him in connection with the Battle of Tsushima. Most members were somewhat more successful. Corbett served the society and ran it for the last decade that it existed, and he ensured that it was working for the Navy within the Admiralty building, that it was delivering exactly what the Navy needed as the raw material and the digested evidence to form strategy, policy, and to shape education. So it's an all-round program. Another one of his friends, Sir Edmund John War Slade, 1859, slightly younger than Corbett, Director of Naval Intelligence, 1907-09, which is important. Also Commandant of the Royal Naval War College, where Corbett taught in 1904. He was heavily involved in international legal questions, including the Declaration of London. He served in high command abroad, and he was critically involved in the creation of Britain's holdings of oil, which allowed it to switch from coal to oil fuel for the Navy. BP, originally Anglo-Persian Oil, was set up and run by Slade. He also ran the Official History Project in the First World War, which was directed in an academic way by Corbett, who wrote and chose most of the texts that were published. Both Corbett and Slade are dedicated readers of Carl von Clausewitz. They are using Clausewitz's analysis of war as the critical intellectual component that enables them to think seriously, not about how Clausewitz wants to talk about war, but how Britain needs to think about war. War is not what Clausewitz says it is. War is whatever you need to think about as a nation, and you use Clausewitz's intellectual equipment to understand how your national strategy is evolved and delivered. So they're great believers in the development of Clausewitzian theory into a national program. There's a very important book published around 1900 by the German general Rudolf von Kammerer that says, look, the great thing about Clausewitz is you can develop him. He's not fixed. He's not stuck in the Napoleonic era. He's timeless. But you do have to do the hard work of reading the book, developing and integrating it. And Corbett's work would be very much in the mold of Clausewitz. Lots of serious analytical history leading up to a summation document, some principles of maritime strategy, which fills the place that Clausewitz places on war in. It's the whole purpose of historical study is to understand the past well enough to deliver it as the basis of future strategy. So Corbett is working with like-minded people at the Admiralty. Here's Clausewitz in the posthumous portrait, and here is the opening page of his Hinterlasserwerke, and this is von Krieger. I wouldn't recommend anybody trying to read it in the Gothic script. It really is difficult. Of course, in 1890, Alfred Thayer Mahan, Captain USN, had put forward the thesis that sea power, two words, had influenced history, and that the way ahead for all nations in the future would be to get some sea power and to use it to serve their interests. Mahan's book is one of those moments when the light comes on and everybody realizes they've missed something. Mahan sells sea power firstly to the Americans. It's a very good thing for an American Navy captain to promote the building of a larger Navy. He also ends up influencing a number of other key decisions, not least that of Imperial Germany to build a great battle fleet and challenge Britain for command of the sea. And I put in the Mahan Hall at Annapolis, the Naval Academy, to show you just how mixed up the Americans were when they came to picking up sea power. They put this building up in 1905, and it's quite clearly a French-style Beaux-Arts building. What are they saying? We all know what naval history is all about. There's a great battle and the French lose. And in 1905, the Americans put up a French building to teach their officers and make them wear French uniforms. They're basically saying, whatever happens next, you're probably going to lose. If you're going to copy somebody, you copy the winners, not the losers. Mahan was a Francophone and a Francophile, but he admired the Royal Navy and Britain even more than France. His books are a vindication of British sea control, and he amplifies the role of Britain in the ultimate defeat of Napoleon. He also used Nelson as his star turn for teaching command and leadership, and he would go on to write extensively. Mahan is a book that Corbett has read that opens up the idea that naval history is not just a lot of guns going off and ships sinking. There's a much more thoughtful intellectual process at the middle of this. In Britain, there are people who are reading Mahan. They tend to be generals rather than admirals. These two men are really important, Frederick John Morris and GFR Henderson. They're army educators who are teaching at the Army Staff College, and they're using Clausewitz to address Britain's strategic needs. And they, despite being soldiers, understand that Britain's strategy is maritime. Britain is a small island off the northwest coast of Europe. It has imperial possessions around the globe. It cannot connect with them without dominating the ocean. They understand that. And their work is heavily influential on the way that Corbett will pick up and develop his British way of war. These two men make it possible to read the history of the world in a way that does not suggest the British Army is the answer. I'm not sure the British Army ever has been the answer to any serious question, other than how do you destroy enemy dockyards. That's why Jackie Fisher said the Army is a projectile to be fired by the Navy. You use the Army to destroy hostile naval bases. The best example is Sevastopol in 1855. After 12 months siege, the city was taken and the dockyard was systematically destroyed. That is British strategy. Command the sea, do not march into Russia. And I trust we've remembered that even in 2023. This is the man that Corbett worked for. Admiral Sir John, later Lord Fisher, a brilliant, dynamic, volcanic individual who transformed the Navy, transformed its officer recruitment process so that middle-class boys could get into the Navy. He ended the upper-class control over that process, to the consternation of many elderly admirals. He invented the dreadnought, he redistributed the fleet, he got rid of all the unnecessary warships, the obsolete ones, and he and Corbett were very close. They're both on the left of politics, they're both radical liberals. Fisher has no interest in war. He's seen war up close and personal in the 1850s. He does not like it, and he would like to make sure that there are no wars going forward. He and Corbett are fine-tuning British strategy to make it more and more effective vis-a-vis continental states, and to make sure those continental states know that in the event of a war, Britain will destroy their economy and force them into bankruptcy, leading to them losing any war that they care to start. Fisher and Corbett work as a team. Corbett does not do what Fisher says. If Fisher is talking about an issue and Corbett agrees with him, he writes brilliant memoranda supporting the dreadnought, strategic redistribution, and the changes to officer education, but he will not write on subjects where he and Fisher disagree. And he writes without a fee. He is not being paid to do this. He's doing it from conviction. And he's using his advocacy skills, his courtroom lawyer skills, to take on and debate the issues that Fisher needs. And it's Fisher who will ensure that he writes the great summation of British maritime strategy, published in 1911. So Fisher is First Sea Lord from 1904 until 1910. And he's going to be First Sea Lord when Corbett attends the Quebec Tercentenary, which is a strategic demonstration as well as a major pageant. Among Corbett's many friends is Halford Mackinder, the famous geopolitician who comes up with the Heartland thesis and the pivot area. This is his 1904 map, where he argued that there was very little you could do with sea power to get at what we would now know as the Russian Empire. And therefore you needed to change your strategic judgment. Both these men serve in the leading think tank of the era, the Coefficients in London, and both of them will attend the Quebec Tercentenary, traveling on the same ship across the Atlantic. They will lecture on their chosen subjects and they will interact with Canadian intellectuals while they're there. So Britain's leading naval theorist and its leading geographer are coming to visit to talk about Canada and to talk about where it fits in the world of the future. One of the officers who attended the Quebec Tercentenary is John Rushworth Jellicoe. He was then a rear admiral with his flag on HMS Albemarle, an admiral-class battleship. And he and Corbett had met before. They would meet several times during the visit, and they remained very close to the end of Corbett's life. Jellicoe had long been tipped as the admiral to command the fleet in a future war, and that's exactly what happens in August 1914. So here he is, newly made rear admiral, about to go off on his trip to Canada. Corbett also interacted with intellectuals based in Canada. So Arthur George Doughty, historian, archivist for the Dominion, and Percy Lake, who commanded Canadian forces. Doughty was an import from Britain. Lake was half and half. His father was British, but his mother was Canadian. And he was the expert on the strategic issues in Canada. At that stage, Canada is thinking about producing soldiers. It's not thinking about producing a navy. Corbett goes to this meeting in 1908 on the back of publishing a great piece of work. His book, England in the 7 Years' War, A Study in Combined Strategy, is the outstanding masterpiece of his career, in which he demonstrates how British strategy works in a real-world case. It's about sea control, about amphibious projection. It's about defeating the enemy by non-battlefield, that is, land battlefield means. And of course, one of the pivot points of that story is the capture of Quebec and the fall of French Canada. So he's coming out with that as his resume, but his purpose, and he's been sent by his friend Slade, the Director of Naval Intelligence, is to see what the ideas in Canada are about forming a naval service, that could do the thing that the Australians are doing, which is building up a fleet which contribute to global maritime control. He's aware, as the Admiralty is, that the War Office has been encouraging the formation of Canadian militia and other units, building on Canadian volunteers in the Boer War, and that Canada is essentially taking a pretty militarized view of security, that security is not a question of ocean communications, it's a question of massing military force. So Corbett is looking to have those discussions in Quebec with the leading figures to see if there is any enthusiasm for creating a navy. He's aware that some of the people in Toronto and Ontario are looking at that because they have global economic interests. He's also aware that Prime Minister Laurier and the people of Quebec really don't see the sea as a matter of any interest to them at all. Their interest in defense is defending Quebec. The rest of Canada could probably go and whistle for some help, but Quebec needs to defend itself. And you get a slightly parochial, slightly limited view of what Canada is capable of doing. So Corbett is out there to see how far those divisions go. The Tercentenary, of course, was kick-started by the Governor General, Earl Grey, and he secured the participation of the Royal Navy in what was going to be a grand pageant. We're all used to the concept of pageantry, but in the Edwardian era, these enormous national jamborees, which celebrated the history and projected the future of countries, are happening right across the more civilized parts of the world. A very good friend of mine has written on the Hungarian pageant at this time, which is also a nation-building exercise. So it's about creating Canadians out of the people of different provinces. It's about making Canada whole. And as I said earlier, the First Nations peoples really are little more than window dressing in this exercise. This is very much an Anglo-French-Canadian story. But it's a story which ends beautifully pitched with victory in the War of 1812, the repulse of the American invaders by Anglophone and Francophone Canadians acting together, with a bit of help, obviously, somewhat underwritten from the native people as well. So the Canadian contribution to this tercentenary is a military march past of 12,000 men. It's no small thing to do that. But there are 5,000 sailors marching as well, and most of those are British. There are other participants, however, on the naval side. This is HMS Exmouth, one of the battleships sent by the Royal Navy, and you can just about make out bits of the Quebec waterside and the ships ahead of it. Two ships ahead of it is a French cruiser. This is probably on the last day of the pageant when they're raising steam to go down the river on the flood tide. Apparently they up anchored and set off at a furious pace down the St. Lawrence. One of the other British ships, the armored cruiser Minotaur, very powerful fleet unit, designed to secure sea control but also to act as an advanced element of the battle fleet. And you can particularly see how close this is to the city. Here is Minotaur in different lights, not particularly good photograph, but you can see the positioning right opposite the city. And here is the United States battleship New Hampshire, which represented the next door neighbors. Here is the Leon Gambetta, sent by the French, and they also sent the Admiral Aube. So the French sent 2 cruisers, but Republican France has always had a bit of a tin ear when it comes to talking to Quebec. These 2 cruisers were named for radical Republican atheists. So it wasn't the message that perhaps the population of Quebec were looking for. If you look over the Gambetta's bow, you can see 2 of the 4 British battleships who were at the review. Corbett had joined his ship, HMS Russell, on the 3rd of July in Bantry Bay on the coast of Ireland. So 4 battleships and 2 cruisers set off. They used wireless to conduct tactical exercises. Corbett had a chance to talk to Lord Roberts, who Commander-in-Chief, who attended the meeting, the Governor-General of Canada, and many others. He debated the 1759 operations with historians Arthur Doughty and William Wood. He'd actually been in Quebec before, so he knew what he was doing, and he took Jellicoe on a tour of the battlefield on Heights of Abraham. Shortly after Corbett and his party arrived, the star of the show turned up, which was HMS Indomitable, one of the brand new Invincible class battle cruisers. And here she is anchored up with one of the British battleships behind. What is Indomitable doing at Quebec in 1908? Well, it's brought over the Prince of Wales, later King George V, and it's carrying out trials of the strategic system Fisher has designed to protect the empire. Very large, high-speed capital ships vectored onto targets by a combination of submarine telegraph cables and wireless, and that's why the masts are so high for the early Marconi system, are going to defend the empire against all manner of naval threats. The Australians are going to buy one of these ships, and the New Zealanders are going to buy one and just give it to the British. And one suspects the British were fishing for a Canadian equivalent. They would have liked a ship to be bought by the Canadians as well. That doesn't happen. Corbett realizes that there just isn't anything in Canada that's going to drive that process. Canada has got some fishery protection vessels and a few icebreakers. It's not going to build a navy anytime soon. That's going to change in 1917 when the war at sea comes into Canadian territorial waters, and all of a sudden Canadian interests are raised. And in the Second World War, we'll see that in a much more significant way. On the 29th of July, the jamboree is over and the entire fleet unmoors with the tide pushing them down the river towards the sea, and they set off. Indomitable then carried out a strategic trial. It ran home all the way across the Atlantic at a continuous sea speed of 25 knots, which is top speed, and it was in wireless contact either with Canada or with Britain all the way home. This was the first time a transatlantic crossing had been made at that speed and in continuous radio communication. This was a test for how the British would fight a war in future. Corbett hugely enjoyed the chance to use history and strategy on the imperial stage to see how the problems of the future would be resolved. And the Indomitable's role in this expedition is hugely important for the future. Here is Roberts leading the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada on the parade, going past the Governor-General. When Corbett goes back, he returns to teaching the Navy's strategy course. He returns to writing. He writes a great book about the war between the British and Napoleon, 1803 to 1805, which climaxes at Trafalgar, but Trafalgar is in many ways less important than the wider war. Admiral Fisher retires from the Admiralty early in 1910. He gives Corbett an empty, bound book of leaves, essentially inviting him to write the doctrine primer for the Royal Navy. The new First Sea Lord, Sir Arthur Wilson, then approved some principles of maritime strategy for publication, and Wilson would fight for a national maritime strategy in a cabinet meeting in 1911. The cabinet, a Liberal cabinet, refused to decide whether Britain should have a continental or a maritime strategy. And this meant that in 1914, exactly as Arthur Wilson and Corbett had warned, the government didn't have a national strategy. It had two separate service-based strategies, which meant the army became part of the French army and the navy didn't have a strike force to project power from the sea to secure critical objectives. And this would hamstring the war effort right down to the end. Long-term planning to deploy elements of the navy into the Baltic were abandoned because there weren't any troops to hold Denmark and protect it against a German invasion. So Corbett is writing the national strategy. It's not a national strategy, it's the national strategy. And it's the only one Britain has going to the First World War, but it is forgotten and mislaid in the process. The other great thing that Corbett does is to emphasize the synergy between the new, relatively new profession of academic history, university-based, history for its own sake, serious work, and the intellectual needs of the military. At the Fourth International Congress of Historical Sciences, which was held in London, Corbett used his influence to ensure the Congress had a panel of naval and military papers. And he organized the naval papers, which he commissioned, to provide a textbook for the Naval War course about how naval history operates, where the resources are, how it fits into naval education. His friend Herbert Richmond emphasized what naval officers get out of history. The expert from the National Archives explained what was available, and Corbett explained the synergy of all of this. And he set up a publishing series with Cambridge University Press, of which this is the first volume, and published those essays, unfortunately, just before the First World War, which meant that very few of the people he wanted to read it had the time to do so. There's a timely quality to books, and if they come out at the wrong time, nobody reads them, and this is one of those books. Corbett is working to develop history as a key component in the evolution of a national strategy. Not the determination, but the evolution. This is a moving process. Strategy has to live. If you nail it down and dissect it, it's no longer strategy, it's history. You have to let this thing continue to make progress. When the war breaks out, he's publishing a brilliant account of the maritime operations of the Russo-Japanese War, the latest major maritime conflict. And it literally appears on the day the war breaks out, so nobody reads it. And it wasn't until it was reprinted in the 1990s that its quality became suitably appreciated. Corbett is working for the government both at the Committee of Imperial Defense, where he's the leading voice. He works in the Admiralty building, and his ideas are read but not taken on board by Winston Churchill. This is the younger Churchill. Churchill had sacked Wilson and urged the dispatch of the expeditionary force to the continent in August 1914, despite having read Corbett's book. And Churchill, more than anybody else, condemned Britain to fight two separate wars. And it was, of course, his decision to send the army to France that meant there were no troops to land in the Dardanelles until after the first naval attack had been put in. Nobody in the Navy, including Corbett, thought that the naval attack was a good idea. It should have been conducted by a joint force. So this is where Corbett worked. At the top of the screen, you will see Downing Street going on to Whitehall and Parliament Street. So you've got a rough idea where we are. Corbett operated at number 2 Whitehall Gardens, which was one of the CID buildings. This is now under the Ministry of Defence main building. If you're in Whitehall today, you wouldn't see these buildings. But this is where Corbett operated, working right alongside Maurice Hankey, the Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence, with whom he struck up a very close relationship. Hankey, as you probably all know, was a Royal Marine and therefore saw maritime strategy in a much more pragmatic way than most of his contemporaries. First World War breaks out. Corbett is called in to run the official history program as the most eminent historian of war and also the leading analyst. And the war outside Europe falls very neatly into the prepared agenda of the British state. So December 8th, 1914, the Battle of the Falkland Islands, the German cruiser squadron of Admiral Graf von Spee is intercepted off the Falkland Islands by two battle cruisers, the sister ships of the Indomitable, Invincible and Inflexible, and destroyed. This is a brilliant example of a global movement at high strategic speed, organized and directed by live radio. There's one ship in this whole operation that doesn't see any fighting. It's a big cruiser, sister of the Minotaur HMS Defence, which has the big radio set on. And so defense is wherever it needs to be to relay the wireless messages from London to the squadron that's heading down to the Falkland Islands. After this battle, there is no more World War I. It's a European war into which the Entente powers, Britain, France, and to an extent Russia, can funnel worldwide resources. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, cannot do that. They are excluded from the world ocean, and as a result, their defeat is almost inevitable. So sea control, economic pressure is the thing that's grinding down on the ability of Imperial Germany to wage war effectively in the First World War. So that exercise in 1908, sending the Indomitable across the Atlantic in both directions, is a critical piece of the architecture of victory in a global war. Once that situation has been cleared up, the war at sea is essentially a question of controlling the North Sea. The North Sea, there's only two ways out into the world ocean. You can go through the Straits of Dover, right at the bottom of the map, a piece of water about 26 miles long. Dover is a major naval base. The British have forces there. And the Scotland-Norway gap, which is just over 200 miles wide. And the main British base is, of course, right up there at the top left in Scapa Flow, where the Grand Fleet is stationed. The British have shut off the Germans from contact with the rest of the world. And unless the Germans can defeat the Grand Fleet, they cannot do anything about that. Mahan had pointed this out 10 years before the war began. I think everybody had registered that point, including the Germans. What Corbett and Fisher, who returned to control the Admiralty in late 1914, planned was to send a force into the Baltic to cooperate with the Russians. And this would depend on having a military deployable force ready to hold the two large islands of the Danish archipelago. Remember, Denmark is an archipelago. The Jutland Peninsula is connected to Northern Europe, but the major islands of Zealand and Funen are offshore, and they control access to the Baltic. The British Army, able to hold those islands with naval support, would enable the Royal Navy to take control of the Baltic and complete the blockade of Imperial Germany, cutting contact with Sweden and with Denmark itself. The Germans relied heavily on Swedish iron, both raw iron, but also processed iron and highly finished steel goods, critically ball bearings. First World War is a ball bearing war. If you haven't got lots of ball bearings, you're not going to fight very effectively. The Swedes and the Danes are also producing huge amounts of food. Denmark becomes famous for bacon because the Germans desperately need animal fats. Having mobilized all of their agricultural workers, they can't actually get anybody to raise pigs or get the harvest in. This strategy was the culmination of a century of British thinking about how to defeat continental enemies. And it had a long and very positive track record. The British had defeated Napoleon. They'd forced the Russians out of the alliance with Napoleon by economic pressure. They defeated Russia in 1855 through economic pressure. And this was the way ahead. The British cabinet refused to consider this on the grounds that they'd already committed the army to France and they weren't prepared to have a stand-up fight with the generals. At this point, Fisher resigned, brought down the government, and led to the formation of a coalition government. His plans to go into the Baltic, which Corbett had written up, the version that's in print is Corbett, and you can tell that from the language and the quality of the prose. Even if Fisher hadn't made that the point that it was Corbett's work. This was a document which remained on the back burner all the way through the First World War. At one point, when the Russian provisional government takes over from the monarchy, and then the Bolsheviks come in, there is serious thought given to sending a Royal Navy force into the Baltic to try and secure control. However, that doesn't happen. So what we're looking at in the First World War is a global strategy, which it works exactly as the British had planned, and a European strategy, which works exactly the opposite way to the strategy Britain had planned. Britain had planned to operate as a global maritime player, using relatively discrete military forces to secure the coast of Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force, and that word expeditionary should give the game away, is meant to be deployed to support British interests. It is not meant to become a French army. And that's exactly what happens. It then becomes the political guarantee that the British will stay in the war to the finish. And that is not what it was intended for. As a result, the Germans get the naval bases at Zeebrugge and Ostend right down the bottom of the map there. And they're able to use workshops in Antwerp to build and operate submarines and destroyers out of those two naval bases, which cause significant damage to British shipping and blend into the wider U-boat war as critical elements. So the British failure to adopt the strategy they'd long considered led to serious setbacks, which had a disproportionate impact on the war at sea and led that war to be much longer drawn out than it should have been. So Corbett's battle to set up a national strategy that represented the interests of the British state and the wider empire was defeated. But when the war ended, Corbett was available to make sure that the peace was more satisfactory to British interests than might otherwise have been expected. The League of Nations was being debated in 1917. The British set up a committee to consider what the League of Nations should look like. Corbett is on that committee, he takes it over, and he drafts the original founding charter of the League of Nations. The League of Nations is meant to preserve peace, and by preserving peace, it will enable the British Empire to carry out that evolutionary process that he's been talking about in his writings, both before and during the First World War, the evolution into a sea commonwealth. He preserves maritime economic warfare from American attempts to render the seas free to the passage of hostile goods in wartime, which would have rendered sea power effectively useless. He writes the cabinet papers that do that. He is then drafting and developing a very large, complex official history project. His own contribution, the series of volumes called Naval Operations, which are the grand strategic narrative of Britain's war and the naval operational output. There are then volumes dealing with the economic blockade, one of which was so confidential it wasn't even printed until the 1960s. There are volumes dealing with merchant shipping, with the reliance on maritime trade. There are then a very long and unbelievably dull series of volumes about fighting on the Western Front, which are essentially tactical. If you want to know what platoons were doing on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, it's all in there. That is not something that Britain is going to learn much from strategically. But Corbett tragically died of a heart attack in late 1922, having in chronological terms literally only just finished the Battle of Jutland, where he emphasized that large battles are not hugely important. It's the overall control of the sea that matters. That failure meant that there is no sophisticated analysis in the British official history of the U-boat war, of the final stages of the conflict in Western Europe and beyond. And we're left with a war that literally stops the morning after Jutland as a strategically analyzed piece of business. So what does What does Corbett give us? He gives us the ability to see how national strategy is developed, argued, and to understand that if the politicians aren't listening, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, you're still going to run into problems. Britain survives the First World War despite making a mess of its grand strategy. The contrast with the wars against the French Revolution and Napoleon, the previous total war effort, is striking. The political leadership in Napoleon's era, very experienced, very astute, strategically aware, and they took very good decisions. They did not commit the main army to the main theatre to see it ground up in endless continental military operations. They used it to secure maritime advantage. It's a point Corbett makes over and over again. The job of the army is to enhance our ability to command the sea, because it's sea command that gives us the leverage to deal with these large continental military powers. We cannot defeat them on land. We have to defeat them at sea. And the job of the army is to make that more possible. So this bifurcation. After the war, the Imperial Defence College is set up by Corbett's friend Herbert Richmond to make sure that Army and Navy and even Air Force officers understand they're meant to work as a team and that they're all on the UK team. They're not fighting their own war against the other armed services, which of course is the peacetime practice of all militaries in unified defence structures. On the 24th of January 1915, there's a skirmish on the Dogger Bank in the southern North Sea, and the German quasi-battle cruiser SMS Blücher is sunk. And it seems to the British that the moment has come when they can press forward from holding the Germans on the Western Front to pushing into the Baltic. Fisher certainly thinks this, Corbett thinks this, and it doesn't happen. It's a great lost opportunity. There was a chance to do more in the First World War, and to do it more intelligently. The casualty figures suggest that they made a bit of a mess of running this First World War. So, British way of war, Corbett and the battle for a national strategy. This is all about how we blend history, experience, ideas, agendas, and how we then go back and look at how profitably or otherwise our ancestors managed to use those assets going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'm just on the YouTube channel and suggesting that anybody can bring their questions forward if they have them now. Yep. For you and for our viewers on YouTube, there is a bit of delay between what we see here, as we sort of say in the studio, and what happens on YouTube. So sometimes it takes me a minute or two to get to some of those questions. But if I can prime the pump, as it were.
Absolutely.
Looking forward beyond the First World War, obviously Corbett didn't survive long into the peace after the First World War, and you said his writings didn't really were never completed. But did his grand strategy have any effect into the Second World War and beyond? Was it sort of rediscovered and rebirthed, for lack of a better word?
What I would say is essentially Corbett isn't telling anybody anything particularly radical. That is British strategy. The problem is that in the First World War, it wasn't British strategy. They managed to split these things up and not pay attention. After the war, you do get a return. The role of Admiral Sir Herbert Richmond in bringing out the Imperial Defence College, which is not just British, but it is right across the empire. So officers from all over the empire are coming in. So when we go to the Second World War, everybody is well aware of the Corbett message, because that's the core of Richmond's own output. Richmond picks up the baton that Corbett dropped and carries it forward to 1945. So the men who lead in the Second World War had been through those programs. They're all familiar with the wider constructs of national strategy. They also get taught economics and international law, so they're not even ignorant military men. They're much better equipped. In 1941, for example, the three officers commanding the British services in the Mediterranean were all on the same course in 1930 and were taught by Admiral Richmond. So they were able to get along rather better because they actually knew each other. They'd actually been through these programs. When Corbett is teaching, he's teaching Navy officers and the occasional Army officer. And the Army course has the occasional naval officer on it. But they pull this together at the senior level. So before you go on to general officer level commands, you have experience of national strategy, not just of your own operational level. The British war effort in the Second World War is more Corbettian than it is in the First, largely because France collapsed and the British had no place to fight a continental war. Otherwise, they might well have ended up reprising the First World War in pretty much the same dismal fashion. So being forced off the European continent was a blessing in disguise. It allowed the British to fight their own war and to use their military power to secure other objectives. In August 1940, Churchill, who had made a mess of these decisions in the First World War, detached the only available armored division to Egypt. Everybody tells us there's a desperate threat of a German invasion. Well, clearly there wasn't, because the only armored division that the British Army had was sent to Egypt to make sure that we didn't lose the Suez Canal, because holding Britain is fine, but if you've lost the Suez Canal and Egypt, you probably lost the war. So the British are understanding how to pick the theaters to fight in, how to make sure that they can maximize effect by overwhelming the enemy. So most of the key operations of the Second World War, they're not hard fought or difficult because the British isolate using the sea and they deploy large amounts of military power. My favorite is Operation Ironclad in early 1942. Madagascar is taken from the Vichy French. It's overwhelming force. There is no chance the Vichy can defend this position, so they give up fairly quickly. And this secures the supply routes of the Indian Ocean against German and Japanese forces that were already in Madagascan waters. Again, it doesn't get written up much because nothing went wrong, not many people got killed. And we have to remember that history is not about the big ticket items, it's about long patterns. And the long pattern of British strategy is exactly what Corbett says it is. And the outliers, and the Western Front in the First World War is the most obvious, just show that you can teach people all you like, but if they're not receptive, they're not going to buy that product, and they're going to make a painful process of learning from doing all over again what their ancestors did 100 years before. Beginning the French Revolutionary Wars, the British sent an army into France and they got beaten and came home, and the British didn't do that again until 1814. So Corbett's work survives, but his name drifts out of consciousness. His books go out of print, and it wasn't until the 1970s that Maritime Strategy was put back in print. 1922 edition, 1974 edition. Very, very low sales. Now it's, well, being in print is not very significant these days, but now it is in much greater use globally than it ever has been. He's now recognized as the most important maritime strategist.
Now, we've got an interesting question from Neil, which I think picks up very nicely on sort of your discussion of the fall of France in 1940 and helping that lead British strategy in the Second World War. And he says, sort of theoretically, how would the Corbett strategy have responded to a hypothetical fall of France in, say, 1916? Would it be very similar to 1940, do you think?
Thank you for that, Neil. The one difference in 1916 is that Imperial Germany has a serious battle fleet, whereas Nazi Germany doesn't. It has enough capital ships to be a nuisance, but Imperial Germany has a proper battle fleet. So the invasion risk, which is not real in 1940, has a bit more reality about it in 1916, but only a bit. The British Navy Royal Navy 1916 is so much more powerful than the German fleet. And the risk of putting 100,000, 150,000 troops into merchant ships makes it highly unlikely the Germans would have taken that risk. because as Napoleon demonstrated, you can threaten an invasion very easily, but actually doing it is a whole different thing. Napoleon was never going to invade Britain, but he used, as Corbett pointed out, he used those invasion bases on the French coast to pin the British on the defensive and then assemble his armies, which then marched off into Austria and Prussia. You know, he defeated his European enemies with armies that mobilized at Boulogne. He said he was going to London, but he wasn't, because it was simply not feasible. And he knew that if he sent the invasion out and it was defeated, his whole regime would collapse, and Imperial Germany likewise. I don't think that the Germans would have tried an invasion, but they were certainly better equipped than they were in 1940. 1940, they had nothing. They've either lost or had most of their ships damaged in the Norway campaign. They have no capacity to challenge Britain at sea or to carry troops across the Channel. They have no landing craft. They haven't planned for this. They've done no preparations. And so the whole thing was, in my mind, the 1940 invasion thing is Hitler trying to bounce the British into surrendering. The French have surrendered. Why don't you surrender? Otherwise I'll invade. Well, there's no real invasion threat. And Churchill knows this. And so he's able to spare most of his fully formed units to go and fight the Italians in Egypt, because they can win there and achieve strategic effect. So it's about using force more intelligently, not just piling on more force. It's about thinking about where you can have strategic effect. For the British, command of the sea, North Atlantic, Indian Ocean, bits of the Arctic Ocean, really, really important. Success on land will have to wait until the big divisions come, and they're going to be Soviet and American. The British are not going to win that war on their own. They are going to have to rely on somebody else. That's the way British war works. The British couldn't defeat Napoleon without the Russians and the Prussians and the Austrians. That's how it works. You have to know your limits.
So just quickly before we turn to another question, I wonder if you can stop screen sharing for a minute so that we can see more of your face.
That better?
So let me just double check with Tom. Now I'm seeing your email, I think. So
Yeah,
you don't want to see my email.
there we go.
There
Good.
we go. So we've got another question. You did certainly touch on Winston Churchill. I wonder if you can comment sort of more on his role in why sort of the how big of an impact did he have on abandoning this national strategy?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So Churchill becomes First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. That's the political head of the Navy. But of course, he is himself a cavalry officer. And his default setting usually involves a horse and some turf. So on the first day when Britain is in the war, because they haven't agreed before the war what the strategy is, 4 cabinet ministers meet in a room with 9 generals and an admiral to decide what they're actually going to do. They're in the war, but they haven't actually made their minds up. And Churchill, who is responsible for the Navy, says, well, we must send the army to France. And all the generals applaud, and the admiral, who's the first Sea Lord, can't say anything because his political master has already spoken. So Churchill basically blows up British strategy on day one. And at the end of the war, he realizes that Corbett is writing his incisive analysis of what a mess everybody made of the opening stages of the First World War. And he spends a whole year trying to stop Corbett's book being published, which I'm convinced hastened Corbett's death. The idea that his project would be cancelled by some kind of government fiat. And as a result of Corbett's work, Churchill started writing his own account of the First World War in defense of what he had done. And that ends up, ironically, being the best-selling history of the First World War. It's deeply mendacious and very unreliable on key issues. Churchill attack on Corbett delayed the official history. It put a lot of pressure on Corbett, and certainly, I think, contributed to his death. He wanted not to be blamed for things that he was responsible for, several of them. The Dardanelles, Battle of Coronel, the loss of the three armored cruisers in the southern North Sea, and several other things. But throwing away national strategy is the greatest possible offense. In the Second World War, it's not a case of him learning the lessons. History doesn't allow him to make the same mistakes. The fall of France saves Churchill. Otherwise, he would have kept reinforcing in France to the end, because he saw that as the answer. And if France is not going to hold, you have to pull out and redeploy. So the war stops Churchill repeating his mistakes, not his understanding. He didn't learn the lessons of the First World War. And what lessons he learned were the wrong ones. And if you look at the Norway campaign, he's doing all the same things in Norway that he was doing in the Dardanelles in 1915. Impulsive, underprepared, going against the advice of his senior professional advisors, backing eccentrics, classic Churchill. So we're lucky in the Second World War that he was policed rather better by the military cadre, particularly by Lord Allenbrook, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, who managed to stop Churchill doing quite a lot of things. And the First Sea Lords also stepped in and blocked most of his ridiculous projects. So in the First World War, he's a loose cannon. In the Second World War, other people put more restraint on him. But giving him credit for the strategic conduct of the war would be a mistake.
So I'm going to intervene with a quick question of my own. You had mentioned the U-boat war was going to cause a change in the Canadian thinking around naval power. How did that come about?
Essentially, the U-boat war is happening in the North Sea. It's happening around the British Isles. And as the war goes on, the Germans start to build bigger U-boats. And by 1916, they've sent a U-boat to the United States Naval War College. The United States is neutral. U-boat turns up. The Americans go on board and have a look. If you can get to the Naval War College, you can get to the Lawrence Estuary. And everybody in Canada goes, oh, right, okay, we need to do something. There is no navy to start with, but there's an awful lot of ships and enthusiasm, and a navy is created. You know, it's very late in the day, and it's never going to get up to the standards that a peacetime raised and trained force would get. But it does a useful job. It's a patrol navy of Canada's coastal waters. So Canada wakes up to the naval threat pretty much a decade after Corbett went to check if they were interested and found that no, they weren't. And the lesson is learned, but it's pretty much thrown away between the wars. There is still a navy, but it's tiny. And then it ramps up again in the Second World War. So it's a navy that gets an awful lot of support when it's almost too late. It would have been an awful lot better if more had been put in and there'd been more thought. Because the British don't have spare resources in 1917. So it's, if you want naval defense in Canadian waters, you better get on with it, because we're busy fighting the U-boats in the North Sea. And if we stop them there, they won't be coming to Canada. So Canada is picking up what's getting through the British attempts to control the U-boat war. And it sort of works up to be fairly effective by the end. But it's a very late conversion.
Interesting. No, I wanted to connect that dot. You had mentioned it in your presentation. And then the Tercentenary, the parade, the review, was that on the Plains of Abraham?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yes, it's a very big jamboree, and of course they've actually done a bit of landscaping up there, so that they take some of the old buildings off the battlefield to put it a bit more like it would have been in Wolfe and Montcalm's day. And it's very much an attempt to create something out of two very different traditions, two different histories, and to say that everybody on the day fought well, and they're all Canadians now. try and bury the hatchet would be the wrong word, wouldn't it? So that brings in other people as well. But to create a new sense of a nation at a stage when the possibilities of that identity being lost are, I think, quite significant. So it's a very large public statement, stage managed by the British. It's the Governor General who gets this all up and running. It starts off with a small project, and he then ramps it up and gets a lot of British support and gets some very interesting people to attend. The senior peer of the realm in England, the Duke of Norfolk, comes to attend because he's a Catholic. And so there's a very clear attempt to bring people along who are going to be positive. The Prince of Wales coming is huge. Because in 1908, there's only an heir. There aren't any spares. This is a big investment being made in this story. So I think it's a very significant moment in time. And what the British are finding is Canada is capable of mobilizing military power, but it's not yet minded to mobilize naval power. And that's going to take a different lesson. You can't persuade people to do that. You actually have to show them just how bad things are going to get if the U-boats turn up, and then it picks up. And in the Second World War, it's much easier because the memory of the first comes in, and Canada begins to pick its navy up very quickly. But it does wait until the war starts. There's not much pre-war preparation.
Yeah, but Second World War, by the end of the war, I forget, the Canadian Navy was the fourth or fifth largest in the world. It was amazing.
The third. And then, then the war goes away and it drops back to a bit more like the normal size. And the Russians end up building another navy because they didn't have one in 1945. Yeah.
If I could close with one more question from Neil, if that's all right. This is I think I've got them all, but Neil said, I'm just going to read it because I've been listening to your previous answers, so I haven't read it yet. So he says, arguably the strangulation of Germany had worked by late 1918. Did Corbett or Fisher suggest how quickly blockade would work with the Baltic and other elements of the Imperial Strategy in place? So if they had have made it to the Baltic, would it sped up the timeline significantly?
Yeah, thank you for that, Neil. That's a really important question. How long is it going to take? Well, the first thing is that on day one, the Germans have just mobilized pretty much everybody who works on the farm. They're expecting to win this war in 6 months, not because that's a rational thought, but because that's the only way they can get the troops back home to plant next year's crops. If you study ancient history, you'll know that the Greeks used to fight after the harvest came in, and they stopped fighting before it was time to sow next year's crops. The Germans are doing the same thing. The German army is largely made up of agricultural workers. The German army does not recruit from the industrial zones. It finds those people to be too well educated and mostly socialist. So it's recruiting from rural areas. It's massively mobilized. It's completely destroyed its food base. So by the end of the first year, the Germans are starting to run out of food, and the German rationing system, which is run by the state, is struggling to keep the army fed at levels where men are still effective and not starve the civilian population. And it's cumulative. The version that we get with the Baltic still open, it's possible for Germany to carry on, but they cannot carry on at pre-war levels. And there's a marvelous line in Avner Offer's great book, The First World War, an Agrarian Interpretation, where he says the Germans lost the First World War because they were depressed at being confined to a vegetarian diet. It's tongue-in-cheek, but there's merit in it. Germany has the highest level of animal fats intake of any civilian population anywhere in the world, 1914. And by the end of the war, they have the lowest animal fats intake of any civilian population in the world outside of Buddhists. And that does have an impact. People do die in Germany of malnutrition, malnutrition-related disease. It leaves them wide open to the Spanish flu pandemic and other infectious diseases. So how long would it take a full blockade, including the Baltic, to bring down Germany? Well, if we say that by 1918 the blockade had done its job without the Baltic, I'd have thought about 1916. Don't see any reason why Germany would have been able to carry on beyond that level. The whole point of conquering large parts of Eastern Europe was not to defeat Russia, it was to get access to grain and oil. You know, the Germans are going into the Ukraine to capture what the Ukraine is best at, which is generating huge amounts of grain. And they're going into the Caucasus to try and get their hands on some oil. These are things they can't get. And they can't get any decent coffee either, which is, I think, is a big problem for strategic planning. You know, I don't see how you can do strategy without coffee. Where's coffee coming from? Well, the British control the global market in coffee, and the Germans aren't getting any. It has to be smuggled through Switzerland. So, you know, it's very, very prosaic and really quite a lightweight thing to say, but, you know, your routines are being disrupted. The things that you take for granted, those little things that, you know, where's the tobacco coming from? This is an age when everybody smokes. Where's the cigarettes coming from? When you take those decisions, they have consequences. The German war plan isn't we're going to win in 6 months because we're brilliant. It's we have to win in 6 months. It doesn't matter whether we're brilliant or not. If we don't win in 6 months, we're in trouble. And they managed to string it out for 4 years, which was astonishing. But they were always going to lose. Because the Germans are quite good at fighting, but they're not very good at winning wars. Other than Bismarck, they tend to lose.
On that note, I will say thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating, and in an area of Canadian but imperial strategy that is virtually unknown to me. So thank you so much for bringing that to light. And I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say other than we'll see you in December, our next talk. Look towards our talks in the new year and look forward to our conference, February 24th, 2024. So